The night Sarah Mitchell buried her mother, she found the photograph that would destroy everything she thought she knew about her family. It was hidden inside an old Bible, tucked between the pages of Psalms, wrapped in a piece of yellowed tissue paper, like something too dangerous to leave out in the open. At first glance, it looked like any other family photo. Her mother, younger, smiling, standing on a porch. Sarah didn't recognize. Her father beside her, arm around her waist. And on the right edge of the picture, half hidden behind her mother's shoulder, there was a jagged line where someone had taken scissors to the photograph and cut a person clean out of it. Sarah sat on the edge of her childhood bed, her black funeral dress still on, her mascara dried in tracks down her cheeks, and stared at that empty space where a human being used to be. Someone had stood there once. Someone had been loved enough to be photographed, and hated enough to be erased. Her hands were shaking as she turned the photo over. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, faded but still legible, were 4 words that made her stomach drop. Forgive me. She knows. Sarah didn't know what those words meant yet. She didn't know that in less than 72 hours, she would be sitting across from a lawyer who would tell her that her entire inheritance, her mother's house, her savings, everything Sarah had spent the last 6 years caretaking for, sacrificing her own marriage and her own career for, was about to be handed to a stranger she had never met. She didn't know that the cutout figure in that photograph was still alive. She didn't know that someone in her family had spent 40 years making sure that figure stayed silent, and that someone was not going to let a torn photograph undo for decades of careful, deliberate work. And she certainly didn't know that before the truth ever reached her, someone would try very hard to make sure it never did. If stories like this keep you up at night wondering what you would do in her place, hit subscribe right now, because Legacy Whisper tells the stories that families whisper about, but never say out loud. And this one only gets darker from here. Sarah was 42. And for the last 6 years, her entire life had revolved around a small yellow house on Maple Street where her mother, Eleanor Mitchell, slowly lost her mind to dementia. Sarah had quit her job as a schoolteacher to move in. She fed her mother soup when Eleanor forgot how to hold a spoon, sang her old church hymns when she couldn't remember her own children's names, sat beside her hospital bed every night for the final 3 months while her older brother Daniel flew in twice, stayed for dinner, and flew back out to his life in Chicago. Daniel was the golden child. He always had been. Sarah was the one who stayed, the quiet one, the reliable one, the one everyone assumed would always be there, so no one ever thought to thank her for it. She used to tell herself it didn't matter. But some nights, sitting alone with the television humming and her mother snoring down the hall, Sarah would look at old family photos on the mantle and feel a strange, cold ache she couldn't explain. Like there was a room in her mother's heart she was never allowed to enter. There were other things too. Small things she had buried so deep in her memory she almost forgot them. The locked drawer her mother guarded so fiercely, Sarah was forbidden to even dust near it. The late-night phone calls her mother always took in the backyard, her voice dropping into a hush Sarah could never translate. And the man, a stranger who showed up at the edges of Sarah's childhood like a shadow that never fully left. A family friend her mother called Mr. Colton, who visited twice a year and left just as quietly as he came. Sarah had never once heard her mother laugh in his presence. She had only ever seen her go still, the way a rabbit goes still when it senses a hawk circling overhead. She found out what all of it meant 4 days after the funeral. The reading of the will was supposed to be simple. Eleanor hadn't been a wealthy woman, but she owned the house outright, had a modest savings account, and a small life insurance policy. Sarah expected it to be split between her and Daniel, maybe with a little more coming her way, given everything she had sacrificed. She wasn't greedy. She just wanted, for once, to be acknowledged. Instead, the family lawyer, a soft-spoken older man named Mr. Whitfield, who had handled Eleanor's affairs for over 20 years, cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and said something that made the room go completely silent. Before we proceed with the immediate family, there's a provision in Eleanor's will that requires me to locate a third beneficiary, a woman named Grace Bennett. Sarah blinked. Who? Daniel leaned forward, his jaw tightening. There's no Grace Bennett in this family. According to your mother's most recent will, updated 8 months ago, Mr. Whitfield said carefully, Grace Bennett is to receive the house on Maple Street, along with the entirety of the savings account. The remaining life insurance policy is to be split between the two of you. The room tilted. Sarah felt her pulse pounding in her ears. 6 years. 6 years of her life poured into that house, into that woman, and her mother had given the house to a stranger. This has to be a mistake, Sarah said, her voice cracking. Mom had dementia. She wasn't in her right mind when she wrote this. She was evaluated by a physician at the time of the update, Mr. Whitfield said gently. She was deemed competent. I'm sorry, Sarah. I know this isn't what you expected. Daniel stood up so fast his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. This is insane. Sarah gave up everything for that woman. Everything. And she's leaving the house to some random person named Grace Bennett. Sarah barely heard him. Her mind had gone somewhere else entirely. Back to a cracked leather Bible and a torn photograph with 4 haunting words scrawled on the back. Forgive me. She knows. Mr. Whitfield, Sarah said slowly, her voice trembling. Who is Grace Bennett? The lawyer hesitated, the way people hesitate when they know something is about to break a family apart. I was instructed only to locate her and deliver a letter. Your mother didn't share her identity with me beyond a last known address in Ohio. There is one other thing. Sarah, your mother left specific instructions that if anyone tried to have this will contested or investigated by outside parties, I was to inform a man named Robert Colton immediately. She was very insistent about that clause. I've never seen a client so afraid of a piece of paper before. The name hit Sarah like a slap. Mr. Colton, the man from the shadows of her childhood. Suddenly, the locked drawer, the hushed phone calls, the stillness in her mother's eyes whenever he appeared. All of it stopped feeling like unrelated fragments of a strange childhood and started feeling like pieces of a warning her mother had never found the courage to say out loud. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat at her mother's kitchen table with the torn photograph in front of her, running her thumb along the jagged edge where someone had been cut away. And she made a decision that would change the rest of her life. She was going to find Grace Bennett herself. And she was going to find out exactly what her mother had spent 40 years hiding, and who Robert Colton really was. She didn't get the chance to start quietly. 2 nights later, someone broke into the house on Maple Street. Nothing was stolen, but every drawer in Eleanor's bedroom had been pulled open and emptied onto the floor, and the old leather Bible from the nightstand was gone. Someone had come looking for something specific and hadn't found it. Because Sarah had already taken the photograph home 3 nights earlier, she called the police. No forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing but muddy boot prints leading from the back door to her mother's bedroom and back out again, in a size that matched almost exactly the boots Sarah remembered Robert Colton wearing on his last visit to Christmases ago. She didn't tell Daniel yet. Instead, she drove 6 hours to Ohio, to the address on Grace Bennett's last known record. Glancing in her rearview mirror more times than she wanted to admit, the house in Ohio was smaller than Sarah expected. A modest brick bungalow with the wraparound porch and wind chimes that clinked softly in the July breeze. Sarah sat in her car outside for almost 20 minutes before she found the courage to walk up the driveway. Her hands were sweating. She had rehearsed what she would say a dozen times on the drive, and every version sounded ridiculous. The moment she imagined saying it out loud, a woman answered the door. She looked to be in her mid-40s, with sharp brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a loose bun. And the moment Sarah saw her face, something inside her chest seized up like a fist closing around her heart. Because the woman looked like her. Not exactly, but close enough that a stranger passing them on the street might have mistaken them for cousins. Maybe sisters. Can I help you? The woman asked, her tone polite but guarded, her eyes flicking past Sarah to the empty street behind her, as though checking whether anyone had followed. My name is Sarah Mitchell, Sarah said, her voice shaking. I think you might have known my mother, Eleanor Mitchell. The woman's face went pale. She gripped the doorframe like she needed it to stay standing. You'd better come inside. And lock the door behind you. They sat across from each other at a small kitchen table, a pot of untouched tea between them. And for a long moment neither woman said anything. Sarah finally slid the torn photograph across the table. I found this in my mother's Bible after she died. There's a piece missing. Someone was cut out of this picture, and I think it might have been you. And 2 nights ago, someone broke into her house and stole the Bible itself. I think they were looking for this photo. Grace's hands began to tremble the moment she saw the picture. I haven't seen this photo in almost 40 years. And I know exactly who broke into that house. Robert Colton, Sarah said quietly. Grace's eyes went wide with fear, not surprise. How do you already know that name? He's been a shadow in my whole childhood. My mother was terrified of him, but she also let him into her house twice a year like clockwork. Who is he? Grace stood up, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain shut, as though even saying his name in a lit room felt dangerous. Robert Colton arranged my adoption 40 years ago, and he made sure it stayed buried. Not out of kindness. He profited from it. Your grandparents paid him to make me disappear quietly, without a trail, because your father's family would have canceled the wedding if word ever got out that Eleanor had a child out of wedlock. Colton has spent 40 years holding that secret over your mother's head, and mine ever since. Every visit he made to your house wasn't a courtesy call. It was a payment collection. Sarah felt sick. Payment for what? Silence, Grace said bitterly. Your mother paid him for decades to make sure he never told your father, never told anyone what really happened. I believe she was still paying him the week she died. I think updating her will 8 months ago wasn't only guilt. I think she was trying to get out from under him before it killed her. And he already knows that will exists. He's not going to let it stand quietly. The words landed like a physical blow. Sarah felt the room spin, her hands gripping the edge of the table to keep herself upright. 40 years of quiet threats. 40 years of her mother's strange silences, her frightened stillness. All of it finally made a horrifying kind of sense. That's not possible, Sarah whispered, though she already believed every word. My mother only had 2 children raised in that house. Me and my brother Daniel. She had 3, Grace said quietly. I was born when your mother was 17, before she married your father. Her parents, your grandparents, were ashamed. They said a child out of wedlock would ruin the family name. So they hired Colton to make me disappear, with no paper trail, because a trail could someday be used against him too. I was raised by a family 2 counties over, who never told me the full truth, until I was 25, and found old letters in my adoptive mother's attic. That's how I learned Eleanor Mitchell's name. I spent almost 20 years afraid to reach out, because Colton made it clear that contacting Eleanor would have consequences. What kind of consequences? Grace's jaw tightened. The kind that cost my adoptive father his job, 2 years after I asked one too many questions. The kind that made sure I understood. Some secrets are protected by people who are willing to hurt anyone standing in the way. 8 months ago, when Eleanor found out she was dying, she reached out to me first, against everything Colton had warned her about for 40 years. She said she couldn't die with this secret buried anymore, no matter what it cost her. We wrote letters. She visited twice, quietly, when neither of you was around. She told me she was terrified Colton would find out, but she said dying scared her less than dying silent. Sarah sat in stunned silence, memories rearranging themselves like puzzle pieces clicking into place, darker now than she had imagined possible. The strange sadness in her mother's eyes every July, the same month, Sarah now realized, must have been Grace's birthday. The locked drawer that turned out to hold decades of cash withdrawal slips, all round numbers, all around the same 2 dates every year. The cold distance Sarah always felt, guarded not by shame alone, but by fear of a man who had built a quiet business out of other people's secrets. He broke into the house, Sarah said, her voice shaking now with something closer to anger than grief. He's looking for proof the will is real, isn't he? Proof that she finally told someone. If he thinks there's a witness, a letter, anything that shows Eleanor spoke to me before she died, Grace said grimly, he'll try to make sure it never sees daylight, one way or another. He's done it before. He is not someone who accepts losing quietly, Sarah's phone buzzed on the table. An unknown number. The voice on the other end was calm, unhurried, almost pleasant in a way that made her skin crawl far more than shouting ever could have. Sarah Mitchell, I understand you've been asking questions. Your mother spent a long time making sure stayed buried. I'd hate for you to dig somewhere you can't climb back out of. The line went dead. Sarah sat frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear. That was him, she whispered. Grace nodded grimly. Now, you understand why your mother stayed quiet for 40 years. Sarah drove home that night with the doors locked, checking her rearview mirror every few minutes, certain more than once that the same dark sedan had been behind her for miles. She knew she couldn't face this alone anymore. It was time to tell Daniel everything, even the part that scared her most. The family dinner Sarah organized 2 days later was the hardest meal she had ever sat through. She had invited Daniel to the house on Maple Street under the pretense of sorting through their mother's belongings, but the real purpose sat heavy in her chest the entire drive over. Grace waited in the car outside, too nervous to come in, until Sarah gave the signal. And Sarah spent the first 20 minutes of the visit unable to say a single word about any of it. You're being weird, Daniel finally said, setting down his coffee. What's going on? And why does the back door have a new deadbolt on it? Sarah took a deep breath. Because someone broke in 3 nights ago. And because I think I know why. Daniel, do you remember how Mom used to disappear every July? She'd say she was visiting an old friend, and she'd be gone for a day, sometimes 2. Daniel frowned. Vaguely. Why does that matter? Because I found out who she was visiting. Sarah pulled the torn photograph from her purse and slid it across the table, just like she had done with Grace weeks earlier. We have an older sister. Her name is Grace. Mom had her before she married Dad, and her parents forced her to give the baby up. That's who Grace Bennett is. That's who the house was left to. And there's a man named Robert Colton, who arranged the adoption 40 years ago, and has been quietly blackmailing Mom for it ever since. He broke into this house looking for proof that Mom told anyone the truth before she died. And 2 hours ago, he called my cell phone and told me to stop asking questions. Daniel went very still, the color draining from his face. He called you? What exactly did he say? That I'd hate to dig somewhere I couldn't climb back out of. Daniel's hands curled into fists on the table. That's a threat, Sarah. That's an actual threat. We need to call the police right now. And tell them what? Sarah said, her voice cracking with exhaustion. That a stranger made a vague comment on the phone? He's been careful for 40 years, Daniel. There's no paper trail. Grace said he made sure of that from the very beginning. Daniel stared at the photograph a long moment, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that looked dangerously close to grief. You're telling me Mom kept a secret like this for 40 years, paid some man to keep it buried, and never said a word to either of us? And now, he's threatening you over it? She was terrified, Daniel. 17 years old and terrified. And then trapped for decades after that. She was trying to protect her marriage. Protect us. And once Colton had his hooks in her, she probably didn't see a way out that didn't put someone she loved in danger. So what? We're supposed to just sit here and let this man threaten my sister because Mom felt guilty on her deathbed? Daniel snapped, pushing back from the table and pacing the kitchen, his hands raked through his hair. No, Sarah said, standing up straighter than she had in weeks. We're supposed to do exactly what Mom was too afraid to do. We're supposed to bring it into the light, all of it, so a man like Colton has nothing left to threaten us with. Daniel stopped pacing. Meet her, he said finally. Grace. I want to see her for myself. Sarah walked to the front window and pulled back the curtain to signal the car parked across the street. A moment later, Grace walked up the driveway, her steps hesitant, her eyes darting nervously toward the house that should have been her childhood home and never was, and toward the street beyond it, checking, the way Sarah now understood she always would, for a dark sedan that might be watching. When Daniel opened the door and saw her standing there, he went completely still. Because Grace didn't just resemble Sarah, she had their mother's exact eyes. The same slight tilt of the head when she was nervous. The same habit of twisting her hands together that Eleanor had done for as long as either of them could remember. "You have her eyes," Daniel said quietly, his voice breaking. "I've been told that," Grace said, tears welling up. "I never got the chance to hear it from someone who actually knew her." That night, the three of them made a plan neither Sarah nor Daniel would have believed themselves capable of a week earlier. If Colton wanted the will destroyed, they would make sure it couldn't be. Daniel, who had years of corporate law experience, contacted a colleague who specialized in elder financial abuse and began building a file from every withdrawal slip in Eleanor's locked drawer. Grace brought forward the letters Eleanor had written her, letters that named Colton and described, in Eleanor's own trembling handwriting, exactly how the arrangement had started and never stopped. It took 3 weeks of quiet, careful work Sarah did with her heart in her throat every day, jumping at headlights outside her window, checking the locks twice before bed. But when Daniel's colleague finally filed a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office, it triggered something Colton had spent 40 years avoiding: a real investigation, with subpoenas and bank records and a paper trail he could no longer scrub clean, because this time, it wasn't one frightened woman standing alone against him. It was 3 siblings standing together. Colton was arrested 2 months later on charges of extortion and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Once investigators uncovered that Eleanor had not been his only victim. 2 other women connected to adoptions he had quietly arranged decades earlier came forward, each describing the same slow, patient blackmail that had drained their lives in ways no one outside their own kitchens had ever seen. Sarah sat in the courtroom the day of his sentencing, Grace on one side of her and Daniel on the other, and for the first time since she'd found that torn photograph in her mother's Bible, she felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for as long as she could remember. It wasn't triumph exactly. It was quieter than that. It felt like the end of a fear she hadn't fully understood she'd been carrying her entire life. A fear that had lived in her mother's silences and settled into Sarah's own bones without either of them ever naming it. In the months that followed, something unexpected bloomed out of the wreckage of that hidden truth. The 3 siblings started meeting for dinner every few weeks. Grace began visiting the house on Maple Street, not as a stranger, claiming an inheritance, but as a sister, finally reclaiming a place in the family she had been erased from decades earlier, and finally safe to do so in the open. Sarah sold her share of the house to Grace for a fair price, using the money to finish the graduate degree she had abandoned years earlier. She rebuilt her career. She rebuilt her marriage, nearly crumbled under 6 years of sacrifice no one had acknowledged. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like the missing piece of her own life had finally been found, not through revenge, but through the truth her mother had been too afraid to speak while alive, and too brave to leave buried when she died. The photograph sits framed on Sarah's mantle today, but it's not the torn one anymore. It's a new one, taken last Thanksgiving, of 3 siblings standing together on the porch, arms around each other, nothing cut away, nothing hidden, no shadow waiting at the edge of the frame. Sarah keeps the old torn photo in a drawer, not from shame, but because it reminds her of something she now believes with her whole heart. Secrets don't protect the people we love. They only delay the pain and give dangerous men a place to hide. Eleanor Mitchell spent 40 years believing silence was the only way to survive her mistake. But it was the truth, finally spoken, that gave her children the family she always wanted to give them, and put the man who profited from her fear behind bars where he belonged. If this story kept you on edge, if it made you wonder what your own family might be quietly protecting, tell us about it in the comments below. Sometimes the people we think we know the best are still holding onto a truth they're too afraid to say out loud. And sometimes there is someone else in the shadows making very sure that truth stays buried. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the truth, however dangerous, is always worth uncovering. This has been Legacy Whisper, and we'll see you in the next story.